morning, guys. So I'm Getty Hill. I am the co-founder of GFX Labs and Interest Protocol. Prior to starting GFX about a year ago, I spent most of my time at a trading firm called Grapefruit Trading with my co-founder. So our whole background is like finance and trading, and particularly DeFi protocols. We built and ran like delta neutral strategies for those guys for a long time before we decided to go off on our own. Before we get into the topic of bar-lend protocols, some of you may be familiar with us. GFX Labs does a lot of protocol governance work all over the place: Optimism, Uniswap, MakerDAO, Hot Protocol more recently, and we used to do a ton of stuff over at Compound. But to the bread and butter of today's presentation, I kind of want to go through the progress of bar-lend protocols over the last like 4 or 5 years. A lot of stuff has happened. The industry's changed pretty massively. For those who aren't familiar with bar-lend protocols, the general idea here is pretty simple. Someone wants to borrow assets, you have to post collateral. Otherwise, you can just be a lender to the protocol and post, whatever asset you're interested in lending. Every single bar-lend protocol has like 4 key components that you can really, you just have to have in some fashion. Whether it's an oracle system to actually get your prices, a liquidation system to actually manage risk of the platform, interest rate system in the protocol to like gauge how much folks can actually borrow from the protocol, or some type of mechanism to actually distribute that interest at the end of the day. MakerDAO's Psi, which is like practically a relic at this point, came out like a long time ago, back in like late 2017. It was a pretty simple idea. Like, we had Bitcoin, we had ETH at this point. These things were really volatile. People were trying to get around the idea of like these things could be a money. But when it was fluctuating by like 15, 20% in a given day, it's pretty hard to say that thing is a money, right? So the folks are like, how do we get a derivative asset that is stable, that shares as many properties as possible with its parent, these parent assets of the protocol? So MakerDAO's Psi, you could post ETH up in the protocol, borrow a DAI against it, the protocol would lend to you, and the protocol would be actually the one, the governance there, choosing the interest rates to actually like lend to you, kind of like a Fed-like model, where like a group of folks get on a call and they're like, this is what the rate's going to be. Back then, they really only had like 2 mechanisms to maintain stability in the protocol, so DAI slid around a lot. The stability fee, which was essentially just like the interest rate in the protocol, and then they had this emergency shutdown, which to some degree is as scary as it sounds. Like, you could just like, enough people said we wanted to shut the thing down, they could just like pull the fire alarm, and all of a sudden like all the Psi in existence would just go to like $1 worth of ETH. But it was like the thing that you could like sleep soundly at night, that at least if it fluctuated 10% DAI, it would get back to $1. Compound, which is like my favorite, the thing I got into DeFi for, the thing that made so much sense to me was Compound. So the V1 of the protocol was like the first money market protocol on Ethereum. The idea here, instead of being MakerDAO as like the lender, the direct lender to individuals, Compound was like a middleman. It said, we're going to develop this open source software that's totally open and permissionless that anyone can utilize to do their bar-lend activity. Introduced the idea of like liquidity pools, so you'd participate with other folks in these pools. You not necessarily like know who those folks are, but for the most part, you know that everyone's under the same terms, everyone's getting the same interest rates, everyone's playing the same game. There's no type of special like quid pro quo that's happening with anyone. The fact that you can instantly borrow lend with these pools for 1 block, 1,000 blocks is just really fascinating. Nothing like this had existed, and it's something that hardly exists in traditional finance either, so it just makes a lot of sense. It's like one of those things that is enabled by the power of Ethereum and the blockchain. Fast forward some time, you get to Compound V2, which was really like a general rework of the system. You learn a lot after you develop something for the first time. We introduced C tokens to the system that actually had like an exchange rate. So in order to accrue interest to individuals, they would adjust this exchange rate on the protocol. A multi-contract system, they could control assets with much more specificity, whether it be the collateral factor or other facets in here. The introduction of borrow caps into the protocol, which is really fantastic security measure. And then eventually the introduction of the comp token, which was particularly exciting. For any of you who were around in 2020 or have heard about DeFi summer, comp and the comp token was really the catalyst for everything that occurred, because it was the first introduction of huge yield farming before yield farming was really even a term at that point. And they introduced really what was the governance contracts that are now used throughout crypto and power all the major governance protocols, with the exception of MakerDAO, I would say. Fast forward some time, we come back to MakerDAO's multi-collateral DAI. The goal from MakerDAO was always to have a multi-collateral system. So single collateral DAI, it was neat. It was a stepping stone. They had to produce an absurd amount of infrastructure that existed nowhere. A lot of the tooling in crypto, and especially Ethereum, was developed because of MakerDAO, because they were just so early at being the first on every single problem. It was an immense amount of work for these folks. So once multi-collateral DAI came out, it was great. They could support, essentially an unlimited number of assets. The whole protocol infrastructure became much more robust and much more malleable over time. And now, the protocol has been around since 2019, still the most popular and largest DeFi protocol by far, and continues to have innovated significantly since 2019. Aave, the one we haven't mentioned too much so far yet, Aave is a bit unique. Aave started off as a whole other protocol being ETH-lend a long time ago. P2P lending protocol, didn't get a ton of traction, saw a compound in 2020 and was like, that kind of makes sense. Maybe we should do something like that too. They introduced A tokens and flash loans. So compound runs on this exchange rate model of C tokens. A tokens are neat because they are actually equivalent to the underlying token there. So that way, if you deposit an ETH into Aave, you get an A ETH back. It should be about the price of an ETH, pretty close to. Flash loans was the real excitement when Aave came out. This was like a pretty new concept at that point, that you could lend money to individuals for, a finite amount of time, essentially like an instant, to be utilized. And it really started the Darwinism of DeFi protocols in a sense, where folks who didn't otherwise have the capital to exploit protocols all of a sudden could get a $100 million loan, return it back a second later, blow up a DeFi protocol in the midst there, which was really entertaining, very controversial, but of course at this point been widely accepted, and now every DeFi protocol really has flash loans at this point for the bar lend stuff. V2 came around, introduced stable rates, credit delegation, debt tokenization, a bunch of other neat stuff. I'm certainly simplifying that for the Aave fans in the room, so don't hate me. But really what Aave did extremely well with V2 was the first protocol to prove that you really need to do business development well. They went and deployed on Polygon early on, and then a bunch of other side chains and L2s, and that's what launched them as far as market share over Compound, and took that lead quite substantially. And also just the general idea of we should be more pro-risk and managing a greater number of collateral assets on the protocol. So really interesting from that standpoint of they diverged from tech being the necessity to succeed in just pure business development, where it could get you there. The V3 of the protocol announced last spring. Pretty interesting. They introduced portals. It's more around reducing the fragmentation of liquidity across all the Aave deployments, which is nice. It makes sense. It hasn't really been used a ton yet. Sometime soon. Had the high efficiency mode. The high efficiency mode, there's E mode on there as well, which is also really helpful. So that's good. And they have the isolation mode, which we'll get into here in a second. Now, the fixed rate protocols, which I'm guessing since we're in New York, there's a few of you who are in the TradFi world. I personally didn't really come up the traditional way, so the notion of being excited about fixed rate protocols has never really come to me. I know the notional guys and the yield guys quite well. Very interesting technology. It's something like a zero coupon bond system where you're just originating debt, selling it at a discount, and then whoever's buying that can then redeem it at maturity for the full value, and that's how you get these fixed rates. Yield protocol was the first one to the scene. They have a 3-month and a 6-month, which is nice. They have a significant number of collateral assets on the protocol, but you can only borrow, lend, DAI in USDC, which generally fine. That's what most people are doing. Notional has DAI, USDC, ETH, and wrapped Bitcoin, and a 1-year tenure. They do collateral math a little bit differently, but generally pretty interesting protocols if you are kind of interested in fixed rates. Now the permissionless stuff is particularly neat because we're in an era of DeFi, especially back when Cashi launched, which is a Sushi sub-project, where it's folks want to be able to have the Uniswap experience for borrow lend. I want to be able to deploy my own pool, say I want to borrow lend any of these 2 coins whenever I want. Problem is, makes for very fragmented liquidity. The beauty of an Aave compound model is you have these liquidity pools and everyone can get awesome synergy off of all of them. So then Euler comes in really recently, just August, and develops their V1 of the protocol, which in my mind kind of shoots the gap here. It's okay, we want to have the isolated stuff so anyone can come to the protocol and develop our own borrow lend platform, but at the same time, we want the liquidity pool. So they have 3 different types of assets: collateral assets, cross assets, and isolated assets. Cross being just, essentially you can lend it on anything, you can borrow it on anything, but it's not collateral. Isolated, only borrowable on specific assets and only lendable in certain places, whereas collateral is just good for everything. So it's a good middle ground, and so far they've got some decent early traction. Morpho, very new to the scene, but kind of the original Dharma model if there happens to be folks in the room from the 2018 era. I'm calling them concentrated. I don't exactly know if that's the right verbiage, but it's kind of neat because they operate on top of Compound and Aave or whatever borrow-lend protocol they want to build on top of. And they say, look, instead of, if you're a borrower lender, utilizing their protocol, you can come to theirs instead, and they'll promise you a better rate or just as good rate that you would have got on that platform, and then they'll enter you in a queue and try to match you up with someone on the other side. So instead of this like big interest rate spread that you see on Compound and Aave due to like a mismatch, you would get instead like a much better rate. Neat platform, still pretty new, so like take caution if you go use it. For the most part, like seems pretty legit. And then we have Interest Protocol, which is actually our borrow-lend protocol that we launched and developed this spring and then launched back in June. The name of the game across all these protocols is capital efficiency. At the end of the day, like whatever protocol is the most capital efficient protocol, whoever can adapt the most number of markets, the greatest amount of support, like that is who's going to win it out in the long run. We've seen that with MakerDAO. Like at this point, everyone's pretty well understood that MakerDAO does not have the best technology, but they spent so much time and effort into the rest of the organization that it's panned out for them massively. So when we were developing Interest Protocol, we knew it had to be capital efficient, and we introduced this idea of a fractionally reserved but over-collateralized system. Really, this doesn't exist in DeFi at this point. We're kind of like the first ones to do it. That being said, it's a very traditional system. This is like exactly what the banking system runs on, where they say, look, we have a lot of dollars. We want to lend out these dollars multiple times over. We'll take houses and businesses and other collateral. Whereas we're like, we'll take coins. We'll lend out dollars multiple times over by lending out a synthetic asset, USDI. And so this is this interest-bearing asset that anyone can get by depositing one USDC in the protocol. They get a USDI in return. They can use this just like WETH anywhere they want to go. They can use it, and they're free to redeem it whenever they want. So you don't actually have to like go the MakerDAO route of saying, hey, DAI is the money, please use our money. Instead, it's like, yo, this is just USDC. It has interest. That's pretty nice. Feel free to use it if you want to. Feel free if you don't. Borrowers can come to the protocol. They can borrow USDI. If they want to use USDI in their strategies, great. If they just want to redeem it for USDC, that works too. Ultimately, it's just a really effective tool for distributing interest to a large number of people and for the system to be able to lend out the same dollar essentially multiple times. Particularly what was really important for us was a flexible collateral system. So having done a lot of work on Compound, it was always frustrating to be stuck in a very small world in which you can actually add as collateral to the protocol. And so we really want to be able to support rebasing tokens, fiat transfer tokens, weird LP tokens, like anything that folks wanted to come up with, the system should be able to support. And then not only should it be able to support it, you actually need to have like a reasonable infrastructure so that anyone can come to the protocol and propose these things and not rely on the team to do anything. So that was like a really key component for us as well in developing the protocol. In addition to that, we have the liquidation system. We're like the only protocol that like promises to not over liquidate users, which is like this like dirty secret in DeFi that like almost all these protocols I just talked about will generally over liquidate users because it's easier like math in the back end for them. Whereas like we took the time to actually do the math, which is granted not even that complicated. So it's like that's a pretty nice thing to be able to tell users that you won't get over liquidated in times of high volatility. That being said, like liquidations on our platform will happen more often, but they'll generally be much smaller, which in our mind is like very good for dealing with this sort of risk in the space when you don't want to just have to liquidate a $10 million loan. You'd rather liquidate it in increments over time. We have a two-step Oracle system. Right now, it's like a primary of like Chainlink, generally speaking, and Uniswap v3 is a secondary. But this is particularly important regarding to the flexible collateral system in the protocol. It's like you need to be able to have a system to support generally any asset, and each asset's going to have its own kind of collateral and price venue wherever it's trading, most robustly. And you want to make sure you have a system that's really adapted to that, because right now, if you look at like Aave and Compound, they're really stuck with like a very specific framework, and that limits them significantly to what assets they can support. And then we have last, like my favorite feature, we support governance tokens as like collateral and maintain your voting power. So I was like a huge governance nerd, since that's what I used to do a lot of back at Compound and other protocols. Like I hated having to choose between the capital efficiency of my assets and then also the ability to like use and vote with these things. And so now you can actually post your Uniswap token or whatever collateral is on the protocol, as collateral, delegate the votes to your regular voting address, and you maintain your voting power. So overall, it ends up being a pretty robust system. We're still pretty new to the scene, but generally speaking, we're really excited about the technology we have in here, and we just have a ton of experience in the industry that we're gonna keep working on it and keep working it out through the bear run here and have a nice time building the protocol. So yeah, that is the spiel, folks. If anyone has any questions about bar-lend protocols, happy to answer them afterwards as well. I love talking about this stuff, as you probably can tell. But yeah, thanks for listening.